So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bharat Gopalaswamy, and I direct the South Asia Center here. On behalf of my colleagues, I'm pleased to welcome you all to this discussion with Ambassador Lata Reddy. Lata and I have known each other for almost 5 years now, longer than 5 years, where she was the Deputy National Security Advisor of India, and she used to um, direct India's policy on cybersecurity. And she is here in Washington leading a Track 1.5 dialogue um, on behalf of India on cybersecurity. She told me that at one point of time she'd become so tired of dealing with cybersecurity that she wanted to do something different. So we broadly framed this discussion in the age of something where fake news is a big terminology these days. We didn't want to use the term fake news. We said in the age of disinformation and what the implications are. Um, where does India how does India deal with disinformation, and what are the lessons that one can learn from each other, and what are the avenues of cooperation, if any? So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Lata. She's going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and feel free to interrupt her if there is something unclear during the course of the discussion. And I look forward to welcoming her to the council again. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bharat. Well, thank you all for making it out on a very hot Washington afternoon. And the subject I was given was in the age of disinformation, implications, lessons, and avenues for cooperation. And also to talk a little bit about India's challenges in the age of disinformation and how can India and the US cooperate in addressing new and emerging challenges. Why do we call it the age of disinformation? The fundamental question is, do we feel that cyberspace and the internet have in a way betrayed us? You know, the first sort of wonderful expectations that the internet was going to connect us in a myriad ways, but essentially be a positive force. You know, has that kind of changed over the last few years? Has it now become more of a nightmare scenario of cyber attacks, malware, trolling, the using of cyber by terror groups, radicalization, and also, of course, the perennial problems of pornography, child pornography in particular, Bitcoin misuse, and now a lot of talk about the deep dark web and the Internet of Things and how that has the potential to do even more damage. I personally feel it would be a great shame if the internet, which has been such a force for good, for innovation, for technological development, should suddenly become an area where we start to feel afraid of using the internet. And therefore, I think it's important in this age of disinformation, as we call it, to look at ways we can actually make cyberspace safer and come together as countries, either bilaterally, regionally, or even globally, to make it safe. Why is it so complicated to reform cyberspace or the rules of the road in cyberspace? To begin with, there are no universally agreed rules of the road. That is the fundamental problem. There are no agreed borders. You know, it's not a national issue. We've just recently seen with the ransomware attack, there have been 150 countries that have reported some form of problem or the other. And I just heard a report unconfirmed that the ATMs in India are now being shut down because they were being used on Windows software. And until they've all been reconfigured, you know, they can't actually dispense money through the ATMs because it puts the users' accounts in terrible danger. The real debate has been, and that is really the area on which I work mainly on cybersecurity and in cyberspace, is how do we create norms so that countries can come together? Like when something like this happens, it's very difficult for 150 countries to find a forum where they can all talk about this and to decide how they're going to deal with this. Sometimes the number of countries involved could be smaller, you know, and even they don't really have a way other than to set up talks. And the problem is you have to respond to these challenges in real time. So I'll come to a fundamental question that do we in fact have a system of internet governance at all? And my answer is yes. You know, it's what Professor Joe Nye at Harvard calls the regime complex. He's drawn a wonderful chart. I may have a picture of it here, but I don't have a slide, which shows that there's a plethora of institutions, which includes international organizations, including UN organizations, technical organizations, states themselves, multinational corporations, NGOs, who are all in one sense or the other running cyberspace, if you like. But that's not sufficient. How do we create binding norms? How do we create norms that everybody would agree to follow? There's the UN governmental group of experts, but again, that's just a limited number of countries. It's 25, I think, in the new UNGG 5. The earlier, it was only 15, then it grew to 20, then it became 25. And the UNGG 5, as the present one is called, is going to have its last meeting in June, and hopefully the report would come out. I'm hearing very pessimistic reports that nothing much may come out because there's been a real standoff in the UNGG about what can be agreed to. I want to talk about 7 norms that we in a think tank in India, which I'm affiliated with, the ORF, had come up with for a digital society. The set of 7 norms and their corollaries are intended to both talk about intergovernmental and multi-stakeholder processes. As you all know, we started off with a standoff between certain countries, particularly Russia and China, who were keen on a multilateral system. They wanted something like a UN treaty. And I would say the US, Western democracies, and so on, who said that sovereignty was not really the issue in cyberspace, that it had to be a multi-stakeholder system which involved all the stakeholders, including civil society and so on and so forth. I think today and India incidentally was regarded as a swing state. People really didn't know because our statements varied from forum to forum depending on who was speaking on behalf of the government. But even India did eventually come out with a statement saying that we would adopt a multi-stakeholder model. We were not insisting on a multilateral model in a UN treaty necessarily. But we also pointed out that what had been traditionally regarded as the multi-stakeholder model was essentially something which more or less said that the internet is being run by companies and service providers and platforms which are essentially developed in the US. ICANN was giving the domain names, and therefore that system should continue. India and many other countries argued that while private sector had a role, the technical organizations had a role, definitely, and governments couldn't take that role. It also had to reflect the new reality that the largest countries using the internet today are China, firstly, and the second largest is India. India has more internet users than the US. So when you have a situation when neither of them has a root server in the country, and there is a real debate about data localization as well. So what we argued was that the system of multi-stakeholder governance has to necessarily reflect these new realities. And right now the split is roughly 4 billion online, 3 billion offline. I'm just, the figures keep changing so rapidly I can't give you the exact one. But it's clear that the next billion is going to come from Asia. The next billion is not going to come from Asia and to a certain extent Africa. Because here in the West, you actually have close to 100% saturation anyway. So you're not going to get that many more internet users being added. So the question is, how do you come up with a system of international internet governance, which is both multi-stakeholder and takes into account the new realities? The other problem is that geostrategic and geopolitical tensions very often affect the dialogue on cyber. Because, for instance, Russia. It's now very difficult for US and Russia to have a frank and open dialogue on cyber attacks or on the use of cyber for disruptions. For elections, for example. All of these have become very loaded questions. And Russia and China continue to say that sovereignty has to play a very important role. So getting global agreement is going to be a long, tough haul. The other problem is cyberspace really a global commons or not? I must tell you that when we started talking to the US, and when I say we, at that point it was the government of India, and we began our comprehensive dialogues probably in 2011, I was very struck by the fact that there wasn't a common view on whether cyberspace was a global commons or not. Because the Ministry of Defense, for example, said that it was, and the State Department said that it wasn't. The Department of Defense, sorry, here, the DoD. And because they didn't want, because once it becomes a global commons, you also have to kind of regulate it as you have the other global commons. For instance, you have the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal that looks after air travel, and because that's regarded as a global commons. You have the UNCLOS, the UN Treaty of the Sea, Law of the Sea, and for the sea. And for space, you have a variety of arrangements because you have the Office of Outer Space in the UN, you have, and for nuclear, you have the IAEA. And at that point, I think the interest in US and Europe was in not having a formal UN type treaty. So this debate goes on till now, and I think the compromise solution is it may not be a global commons, but it is a global good. It's something that's used globally, that's needed globally. So do we need to have a global approach to how the internet is run, how cyberspace is run, and how it's regulated? But going back to the 7 norms I mentioned, the first norm was realizing the transformative potential of the internet requires progressive online freedoms that move beyond rights granted offline. So in other words, you almost need more scope online than you have offline. And the corollary to that is that real-world regulations must not constrain the advancement of technology. Rather, they must evolve in response. To give you an example, censorship. What you have offline may not apply online, because if you want to keep cyberspace, if you want to keep the internet open, how do you apply censorship rules? Cultural and social approaches are going to be very different in different countries. Can you have a universal approach agreeing that some things are permitted, some things are not permitted? The second norm is the title that we gave was Let Data Flow. But the norm we're proposing is that the global free flow of information must necessarily lead to universal access to the internet in emerging economies that is affordable and qualitatively rich. Because we need the access to be affordable, universal, high quality. This is what every government wants for its people. And access will require substantial investments in the form of local data centers, internet exchanges, and last mile connectivity. And what's happened today is that developing countries are net exporters of data. And so we've become a robust market for internet companies, countries like India. And data flows seem to be thriving globally, even as financial and trade flows dwindle. And this is what came out of the McKinsey report of 2016. And so the free flow of transboundary data must be coupled also with an unrestricted flow of technology. And emerging markets cannot be left behind the curve. And end users should have the latest technologies. So then the question of cost comes in, and that's where the whole zero rating and net neutrality debate started. Because they said, can you give a simpler, cheaper internet to beginner users in developing countries? And the final decision was no. The third norm was, how do we deal with the question of encryption? As you know, this has been a very problematic issue. We saw it with FBI and the Apple standoff with the need to open the phone. And governments around the world are locked in debate with industry bodies and civil society for the right to access encrypted data. But I would say, if you want to preserve the quality of the internet, encryption should be the norm, and any decryption should be subject to rigorous standards of judicial review. So that means you have to overhaul the entire system of legislation that governs encryption. And again, the problem is that this is a national legislation. If you don't have universal agreement, each country will have to legislate on this. And the whole debate on the privacy law is about this. The fourth norm has been, is the responsibility to inspect. And the reason for this is because this comes back to what I was saying about ransomware. States are faced with increasingly dangerous and sophisticated threats from state and non-state actors in cyberspace. And the technological and legal capacity for dealing with these threats in different countries is very different. Not everybody has an FBI, not everybody has forensic capabilities, not everybody can trace it back to origin. Very often, less sophisticated techniques will show you that it originated in country A, when it actually originated in country C, was bounced to country B, then came to country A, and then attacked the target. It is the sovereign function of a state to protect its own citizens and infrastructure from threats and attacks. But at the same time, because of the interconnected nature of the internet, governments and businesses across geographies have to cooperate towards norms of cooperation that mitigate the risk of conflict. So the norm on this is the norm on the responsibility to protect, if you like, is that the responsibility of states to protect their cyberspace is a sovereign function, but it's commensurate with their ability. And the corollary is that the collective responsibility for protecting cyberspace requires global investments, to build capacity in developing countries. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. The fifth norm is that cybersecurity must account for and address technology limitations of the end user at the bottom of the pyramid. And local communities have to be involved in this effort. I'll give you a simple example. In India, we have 22 official languages. And these are languages, these are not dialects. You can take a PhD in them. Newspapers are published in them. TV programs are made on them. Movies are made in these languages. and they're the medium of instruction, of life, of way of living for 50, 60, 100 million people in each case. So you have to develop local content in local languages, because otherwise, it'll be restricted to the small percentage who are fluent in English. And Hindi will take care of about 30% of the population, Hindi and derivatives of Hindi. But you still have a myriad other languages. And the 3 rules for internet governance, which I see in the norms, is multi-stakeholderism should be institutionalized by accounting for diversity in gender, geography, and sectors. And there must be 3 transitions made to accommodate new stakeholders. States must also include communities. That's governments need to include local communities. Transnational corporations must also give space to small and medium enterprises and startups in the cyber world. And the Atlantic will have to move to include Asia and, as I said, Africa as well. And finally, the internet should remain unfragmented. The idea of a splinter net, of a fragmented internet, will destroy the very concept of the internet. So differential trade regimes, and this is important, should not raise the cost of doing business in the digital economy or impede low-cost connectivity to users in Asia and Africa. So these were the 7 norms that we saw as being essential. Now, I'm just going to speak for 5 more minutes, and I want to talk a little bit about what I've talked about the challenges. I've talked about some ways we can address these challenges. I want to talk about what India and the US can do together. As Bharat mentioned, we've known each other for a few years, and we actually started talking about space security, Bharat, not about cyber security, because as Bharat is a space scientist by training. And what I realized when I started dealing with this subject in 2011, when I was Deputy National Security Advisor, was that apart from the need for national coordination, where you have to bring in, I think I have a list somewhere of the number of organizations you have to bring in from each side. There's the Department of Defense, there's the Ministry of Home Affairs, there's the Ministry of External Affairs, which is the equivalent of state. You've got the Ministry of, in India we have a Ministry of IT, we have a Ministry of Telecommunications, you have the armed forces, each branch runs its own cyber security program. You have intelligence agencies, you have highly sophisticated technical agencies, and you have a national center for the protection of critical information infrastructure. So first you need this national coordination. Then you start talking to other countries. So I'm just going to talk about our dialogue with the US, how it started. We found that there were many fractured dialogues going on, with one department and another department and the counterpart in India. But there was no all-of-government dialogue, and that began in 2011. And we pulled together all the government departments. I was at the National Security Council in India, and Howard Schmidt from the White House pulled together the delegations from the US side. We had a all-of-government dialogue in Washington and in India, and that's when the dialogue started. We did not mean to replace, let's say, State Department and the Indian Foreign Ministry's dialogue. Those would continue because there would be specific issues that these ministries or departments had to discuss together in depth and in detail. But it was necessary to have an umbrella all-of-government dialogue. And that, as we progressed with that over the years, we finally got to a stage where last year we were able to sign the framework agreement between India and the US. The 2 governments signed this. It was announced in June, I think, during a prime ministerial visit. and it was actually signed a couple of months later in August last year. Unfortunately, the implementation of this framework agreement, and it's really a tremendous agreement, it's one of the, in fact, I was just talking about this with Chris Painter, who's the cyber point man in the US State Department, and he told me this is the only agreement that the US has of this nature with any country in the world, the comprehensive framework agreement on cyber cooperation with India. The difficulty has been that I think implementation has been slow of some of the measures spelled out there. Firstly, because I think in America, the elections were really, the preparations for elections were at the height by last summer. And then there was the election, then there was the expectation that the new administration would take over. And what would the new administration do on cyber? They've just come out with an executive order, I think it was last week. The White House came out with an executive order on cyber policies and recognizing the importance of cyber. But I think it's going to take a little more time to put the nuts and bolts in place. But it's very good that we have the framework to cooperate. And what I'm suggesting is that we need to cooperate very closely, the US and India, in all the many discussions that are going on. I've got a complete alphabet soup here. There's the IGF, the ICANN, the GCCS, the IETF, the ITU, and our own think tank world, apart from the Atlantic Council, we have the East-West Institute, the ORF, Brookings, Carnegie, you name them, everybody's talking about cyber. Everybody's coming up with reports and recommendations. But the point is, can India and the US decide to take common positions in some of these discussions? Particularly in the international discussions, can we agree to push certain norms as being possible to achieve? And I think if we don't do this, it can't really be an effective move towards introducing more safety into cyberspace. The private sector norms, I think, have made great progress in the US. Microsoft has come out with seminal work on this of all the US companies, and they have actually worked out norms where they see governments as being the lead agencies, norms where they see the technical organizations as being the lead agencies, and norms where they see private sector as being the lead agency. And I think that is a very remarkable achievement, and this is being discussed in most of these bodies I spoke about. NGO-led norms entrepreneurship, as I call it, that is where everybody's talking about what kind of norms we need to develop. As I said, multi-stakeholder approaches. And I think ultimately the struggle between sovereignty and universality, this is something we have to come to grips with. And my own involvement in 2 global initiatives, I think, is worth mentioning. I've been a commissioner on the Global Commission for Internet Governance that was headed by Carl Bildt. We had representatives from 17 countries there. It's not a UN body, it's not recognized by governments, but we came up with an excellent report on what we could do to make cyberspace safer. This was released in 2016. And building on the work of this commission, a new commission has been set up, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. This is a Dutch initiative, and it's being run jointly by the Hague Institute of Security Studies, I think it's called, and the East-West Institute. And I'm a co-chair on this new commission, and they don't want to repeat the work of the old commission, they want to build on the work of this commission. And the specific area we're going to try to concentrate on is internet governance and norms. And the idea is that we would then really try to get this to governments, the recommendations, not just as one report at the end of the 3 years, but as a continuous flow of information. So I think countries have to continue to talk to each other bilaterally I think we have to talk to each other regionally, or what I call plurilaterally, where a group of like-minded countries can come together and discuss these issues. We have to use some of the UN bodies where these issues are being discussed. And I personally think it's going to be impossible to get one overarching agreement on all aspects of cyber security or cyber cooperation or internet governance. What I do see as possible is sectoral agreements, where we can agree that, let's say, computer systems relating to the aviation sector are too important, and that we do need to have universal agreement on what is going to be the response mechanism globally if the aviation critical information infrastructure is attacked. Similarly, maybe on health systems, like the Red Cross, can we come to an agreement that health systems, hospitals should be excluded? I personally think these would be very worthwhile areas for India and the US to identify 3 or 4 key areas, 3 or 4 key norms, and to push to see how we can implement them, not just between our 2 countries, but how do we help other countries as well. And we also, as I think I mentioned the track 1.5 dialogue. I think it's important to see what we have discussed in that. I was just telling Bharat that we had quite a comprehensive round of 3 negotiations on the track 1.5 dialogue. Again, that's made up of about 20 odd people on both sides, run by the Council for Foreign Relations and the ORF. And what we did was, in the first meeting, which was held in Washington, we talked about digital economy issues. We talked about the need to have policy recommendations made by our group to stimulate startup growth, to secure digital spaces, to build consumer confidence, to encourage the adoption of Internet of Things policies to make it safer, and to foster investment in the technology sector. Second meeting, which was held in Delhi late last year, was within the multi-stakeholder platform, how do we improve the mutual legal assistance treaties and lawful access to electronic data? Secondly, how do we control supply chain integrity? As we all know, this has been a big problem with getting safe routers, safe sort of components within our electronic networks. And finally, how do we see that export control regimes which address the question of dual use technology don't hamper our cooperation on putting in safer systems into the networks. This meeting, which just concluded on Monday and Tuesday, we discussed internet governance, how do we counter violent extremism online, and capacity building for cybersecurity, both in the public, that's the government, and the private sector. But an interesting point came up there, that can the US and India actually help third countries to improve their cyber capabilities in cybersecurity policy development and improvement of access. And frankly, I think it can be done, because I think countries really need that help, and if you don't give it to them, your problem is your system is only as strong as your weakest link. So if you have a universal banking system and somebody's banking system is not protected in a small country that doesn't have the capabilities, if you don't help them to develop these capabilities, either you'll have to create small conclaves and there won't be a real globalized financial system, or the whole system will crash. So I think I'll stop there. I've thrown out a lot of ideas and a lot of information, and if any of you are interested in exploring any of these ideas further, I'm available for the next 45 minutes.
So, go ahead.
India has, throughout history, always been a leader of online and developing countries. I originally came from Vietnam. Anyway, if India has the leadership, which I recognize, what do you think the Americans would be able to, with India, provide what you advocate for? Do you see a receptive, affirmative side of the United States, or do you think the United States, like you said earlier, said there's no sovereignty, and it's not going with UN treaties and things that will hamper or, how shall I say, control the United States?
I'll piggyback that question with your approach on helping third countries develop their capacities, build capacities, either technical or human capacity. Sometimes there is also a philosophical difference between India and the United States in addressing third countries. I wouldn't necessarily say weakness, but their lack of capacity. And I'm sure this comes up in debates about, here the taxpayer pays for every technology that the United States develops, whereas in India, the public sector is the lead entity in developing those technologies. How do you reconcile those differences?
If I can take the second question first, Bharat, I don't think it's such a difference, because in India also government revenue comes from taxes. So in a sense, the taxpayer always pays in every country. Where does government revenue come from?
I understand, but here, the lead innovation agency here is the private sector.
Not initially, though, with the internet. If you recall, it was done by the Department of Defense. So now, yes, these giants have emerged, whether it's Google or Verizon or Facebook or Twitter or Microsoft and so on and so forth. But initially, it wouldn't have developed at all if government hadn't financed it. So if other countries have to build similar structures or to develop the same capabilities, the government would have to come in initially. And what I'm suggesting is that why don't you make the third country cooperation part of what used to be called aid in the old days, which is now a bad word, but we now call it development assistance, right?
Trade is a bad word now.
Yeah. So, for instance, instead of just helping on basic developmental issues, you could help them build cyber capabilities. And the US still does a lot for developing countries. And India, in its own way, whatever we can afford, we do a lot. And we're already training numbers of people at our institutes of forensic studies on cyber. We give scholarships to the least developed countries, to use UN terminology. And we have a big program called the ICT, which is technical scholarships for short-term and long-term for people to come and be trained in India. And so does the US. The US has good training programs for foreign nationals. So what I'm trying to say is, why not say cybersecurity capacity building, cyber forensics capacity building could be an area which we could agree to work on together, where particularly from a developing country, I think they need access to the latest technology which they would get in the US training programs. They also need to see how India finds innovative and low-cost ways to do this, which would be important for developing countries to have these tools. How do you bring in local languages? How do you bring in content? How do you make India has one of the lowest cost broadband connectivity in the world. Our phone costs are the lowest, among the lowest in the world. How have we achieved this? What kind of model did we use? Because again, our purchasing power is not high. The average Indian And today it's such a tool of empowerment, I can't tell you, that even the simple mobile phone, leave aside internet or cyber connectivity, the way it has transformed the life of people, and people who were completely not literate learnt at least to punch numbers so that they could talk, they could communicate, they could remain in, these are migrant communities who move from one place of India to the other seasonally to look for contract work. And these people, their lives have been transformed because rather than waiting for a letter to come, which may or may not come, some of them don't even have permanent addresses to which letters can be addressed. They now are in touch all the time. They know when there's a family emergency. They know when they need to send money home. And to me, there's nothing more empowering than seeing people's lives transformed by technology in this manner.
Is the United States receptive to those ideas?
I think the United States is because, for instance, the US, I feel, would like to make it self-sufficient beyond a point. They wouldn't like to see this as an endless process where the US is paying for a program or something. But I think the real issue is the US IT private industry prepared to understand that they have to have different approaches for different countries? And would, for instance, telecom operators realize that they can't charge the same for certain services in a developing country that they can in a developed country? And I think the answer is yes, because I've seen that with just consumer products. The pricing is different in different countries. The famous McDonald example that's always given. What does a McDonald burger cost in different countries? And you'd be amazed at the variations. So McDonald's is smart enough to do that, and I guess IT companies will eventually do it as well.
And when you talked about the governance bilaterally, regionally, and globally, do you want to talk about your region? Is there any framework or dialogue amongst the regional countries, India and its neighbors?
As you know, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SAARC as we call it for short, has been really bedeviled by the very tense relationship between India and Pakistan. So it hasn't grown the way it should have. In a utopian world, it should have been like ASEAN, where a lot has happened. I mean, you're from ASEAN, Madam, originally, so you would understand what I mean, that what's happened in ASEAN is really quite remarkable. And while recently over the South China Sea there have been differences and so on, but they did manage an astonishing amount of unity. What is happening, unfortunately, is that there is a lot of a regional approach in India, but Pakistan is being increasingly left out of that as far as the Indian initiatives are concerned. As you know, Bharat, a lot of things like even the most favored nation status, we gave it unilaterally to all members of of South Asia, but Pakistan will not give it to India, so we now have the MFN relationship with all the other South Asian nations, but not with Pakistan. So I think having a truly representative South Asian sort of approach on cybersecurity, including everybody, would be difficult. But I think certainly with the other countries in South Asia, there's quite a lot happening.
There is a lot happening. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, in the sense that I would definitely say that, say, in Nepal, or I happen to be part of a dialogue with Bhutan. They've expressed a lot of interest in setting up a comprehensive dialogue and a mechanism with India. They've even expressed interest in having a data center established in Bhutan that could service both Bhutan and India. And we're looking at very innovative approaches which we can both adopt for universal access, for the last mile connectivity, including satellite coverage, because Bhutan's mountainous terrain, and part of India also has a mountainous terrain. It's very, very expensive to install land connectivity there. So whether low-flying satellite connectivity could be established there that would give wide coverage over these areas. So yes, there's talks going on about both cooperation on cybersecurity and on capacity building. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, following up on the Pakistan aspect.
Yeah.
One thing I'm curious about, does Pakistan have an official policy, government policy on these questions of international governance and cyberspace? And does that matter to a certain extent? But I'm aware that India and Pakistan, to some extent, are fighting a Cold War in cyberspace. I know that there's folks in both countries who, whether through malice or just pranksterism, attack government websites in the other country. But I've got to assume too that there's some, at some level, the Indian and Pakistani security establishments are involved in this.
So I wanted to piggyback on that. Yesterday I was in a missile defense workshop with Frank Rose, and and he talked about there had been thinking inside the U.S. government about the U.S. and Russia not targeting each other's command centers or critical infrastructure related to your strategic forces. So piggybacking on your question, is there thinking inside the government about the concern about the critical infrastructures as being targeted?
There's concern, but I think the problem is really that the dialogue is at a standstill at the moment, as we know, between India and Pakistan. So I think to get to a point where we can talk about no attacks on critical information infrastructures, we would probably get further in a global discussion, like say at the UNGG or in a UN-led system. Bilaterally, I'm afraid it's going to be very, very difficult. And obviously, the security establishments in both countries are concerned about serious attacks. But frankly, I've never been very worried about government websites being defaced. It's embarrassing. It's not dangerous, because
Sure.
But attacks which can affect critical information infrastructures are dangerous. So far we haven't seen anything like that emanating from Pakistan, not a serious attack. Whether that's lack of capability or simply that the repercussions would be a lot, because presumably they're aware that if they did do something like that, there would be a pushback from India. But it is a matter of concern, I think, and definitely whether or not cyber warfare will be brought into play when there's a real standoff between any two countries, not just India and Pakistan, but any two countries, is a real concern. We've had it here with the Russians, but the real issue is, there are no black and white determinations which you can make in many of these cases, because attribution is really very, very difficult. You can say that it's, in your opinion or in your security agency's opinion, it has originated from China or Russia or Pakistan or India, but actually proving it is a much more difficult matter. It actually becomes more important to react immediately, and I would always say that rather than concentrating on who has cyber warfare capabilities, the more important thing is how do you defend your own cyber networks from attack. I would say cyber defense is far more important than cyber offensive capabilities.
Well, that seems to bring up, I've heard a lot of people talk about deterrence in the same
Yeah, that's the euphemistic term
I'm
for
sure
offensive
sure.
capabilities, yeah.
But no, just the beginning of my question, I'm just curious because I'm really ignorant. Does Pakistan have an official position on the international cyber regime? And if so, does
I'm
it?
really not sure because, frankly, I haven't seen much of a Pakistani voice in many of these international discussions I've talked about, because, cyber policies are a very interesting area because, you know, you have a lot of technical people, right? You have a lot of people who know all about the internet, who know about computer science, who know how to create an attack, how to prevent an attack. But there are not that many people in most countries. And when I talk about capacity building, this is one of the things you have to build capacity on. You have to train policymakers on understanding how cyber policies can affect your country. You know, both the lack of cyber policies or a cyber policy in another country or in your own country. It's really a very small group of people. In fact, I call it the little mafia, you know, that keeps talking to each other from various countries on policy. You can find any number of techies, but you don't find policy makers talking to each other often enough.
So most of these discussions are then boring, right? If you just let the techies talk amongst themselves.
Well, you know, the
How do you-
techies are kind of,
Yeah.
how shall I put it? And I understand it. You know, I have a brother who's a scientist. They're in love with technology. You know, they are just so enchanted with the infinite possibilities of technology that they would, you know, they would go to any lengths to defend the right to innovate, the right to have an open technology in an open environment. But I think there are very serious issues of ethics, of how nations treat each other, and how technologies can be misused. Look at 3D printing. Look at the possibility of hacking into a hospital system and actually killing a patient. You know, should these technologies not be regulated? Who is going to regulate these technologies? I often speak on ethics in technology. It's a subject that fascinates me because I actually got interested through another area because I'm sure all of you have, or some of you may have heard of the HELA controversy. You know, it's a woman called Henrietta Lacks here in the US. And she was an African-American woman living in states in the south, in southern part of the US, and her tissue samples were extracted. She was suffering from advanced cancer, and she eventually died. But the doctors who were treating her took her tissue samples, and they actually replicated them because they had a amazing ability to replicate. And what I understood was from the book as well as the play, which I see you nodding, Julie, so you know it. There was a very powerful theater production done. They actually took her tissue and replicated it, and something like 80% of labs all over the world used tissue samples which were generated from Henrietta Lacks' tissues. And they never took permission from her, they never took permission from her family, and they never acknowledged her. And people won Nobel Prizes for the medical research done on those samples. And it took 60 years for her, I think it was her granddaughter, to take the US government and the US hospital system to court and to get an apology from them. They didn't want money, they just wanted it acknowledged that they had erred in using her material without taking permission. And it's a complex issue because it was also bound up with Jim Crow regime at that time in those states, and how she was treated in hospital and things. So it was a very emotional book. It was a very emotional play. But it made me think, you know, that technology, the doctors who were doing the research were just thinking, how can we save thousands of people? How can we create medical research that is going to be innovative? And they didn't think of the ethics of what they did. So, you know, I keep quoting this on cyber because I keep saying, before we get so enchanted on the Internet of Things and on 3D printing and everything else that we're talking about, let's just think about how we're going to be using these technologies and what are the misuses they can be put to, and how do we ensure ethical use of technology.
Yeah.
To go quickly to the U.S.-India agreement, and I profess ignorance, I haven't seen it, and so these may be off the mark questions. How much of your 7 points, or how many of your 7 points, have been incorporated in that agreement? And what is the relationship relationship between the 1.5 dialogue and the agreement?
Well, I think that the agreement was essentially negotiated between the State Department and the Ministry of External Affairs in India. And it was those two agencies who mandated that we should set up a track 1.5 group. And we actually have representatives from both the State Department and the Foreign Ministry there.
Is it meant then to amend the agreement?
No, not at all. It was just meant to generate recommendations from a multi-stakeholder group, because you have representatives from the State Department and the Indian Foreign Ministry there, but you have people from industry, you have technical organizations, you have civil society people, and they're giving a variety of ideas by which India and the US can actually implement some of the provisions. I just wanted to tell you what were the principles, and incidentally, the setting up of the group obviously post-dated the agreement itself. So no, it wasn't, that was not the cause and effect, but a commitment to an open, interoperable, secure and reliable cyberspace environment. This is what the two countries agreed to promote the internet as an engine for innovation, economic growth and trade and commerce, to promote the free flow of information, to promote cooperation between and among the private sector and government authorities in both countries on cybercrime and cybersecurity, recognition of the importance of bilateral and international cooperation for combating cyber threats and promoting cybersecurity, a commitment to respect cultural and linguistic diversity, a commitment to promote international security and stability through a framework that recognizes the applicability of international law, in particular the UN Charter, to state conduct in cyberspace, and the promotion of voluntary norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. So they want voluntary norms. This is the difference. How do you change that into binding norms? And a commitment to the multi-stakeholder model, which I mentioned earlier, and recognition of the leading role of governments in cybersecurity matters. This was a very important point. And a recognition of the importance of and a shared commitment to cooperate in capacity building, and a commitment to promote closer cooperation among law enforcement agencies to combat cybercrime, and a commitment to promote, protect, and respect human rights and fundamental freedoms online, and a desire to cooperate in strengthening the security and resilience of critical information infrastructure. So it's a pretty broad umbrella, and they do also say we need to share and implement cybersecurity best practices, share information on a real-time or a near real-time basis when practical and consistent with existing arrangements about malicious cyber threats, attacks, and joint mechanisms for practical cooperation to mitigate cyber threats, and cooperation in the fields of research and development, standards and security testing, and it goes on, So there's endless possibilities under the agreement. What I have always found when I was in government and even out of government is it's very easy to design recommendations, reports, and to frame a whole list of things we should do together. The devil is in the detail, the problem is how do you implement? And funding is a very big issue as well. And my own hope and expectation is that the private sector, which is benefiting enormously through internet, it's become such a huge multi-billion-dollar business. And I take heart from the fact that many companies have come forward to fund research and fund capacity building efforts. But ultimately, governments will have to do their bit as well, and taxpayers.
No, but where do the private sectors stand in the US and India space? Are they Are they leading the charge in funding this, or is that a push?
No, actually, I think funding is a real issue because I think that basically I don't know what exactly the US government has done in terms of reaching out to the private sector on funding some of these possibilities. But I think, I don't know about the US, but in India we have something called the CSR Act, the Companies Social Responsibility Act. And right now, by law, companies are mandated to spend 2% of their average annual profit calculated over a 3-year period on corporate social responsibility projects. And I happen to be on a couple of boards in India, so I know that this has to be done, and it's pretty serious. And you have to and the government has actually defined different areas, and education and training is certainly among them.
Yeah,
So I don't know what the rule is in America, but
So we have a robust cybersecurity program, so we could approach you for financing some of that.
yeah. So I think that would that's a possibility because it has to be it can't just be multi-stakeholder in terms of taking decisions. I think it has to be multi-stakeholder in terms of efforts also.
Efforts and taking responsibilities for.
Yeah.
So, I just wanted to dig a little bit on this point in the concept of sovereignty versus universality. So I mean, it's both are very loaded terms, loaded words. What is some of the discussions and where? Can you give us a flavor of these discussions? What are the kind of debates that you see?
See, universality, I can see, for instance, you have to have universal standards for the operation of the internet, and this is what I meant by saying the technical organizations. I don't think anybody has a problem with them having a universal standard which is not subject to sovereign control by an individual country. I think where the question of sovereignty really becomes a problem is in the question of national security issues. And even countries that have been great champions of internet freedom and the privacy, the sanctity of privacy, are forced at times to go back on their own principles. Like, for instance, to be very frank, the US in the FBI Apple standoff. The US would have been the first to say that governments can't ask for data from US companies, right? If China asked for it, or if Russia asked for it, or if India asked for it, or asked Twitter or Facebook to take something down, the US would say, no, this is human rights, this is privacy, etc. But when it hit close to home and they recovered the telephone from a terrorist or a suspected terrorist in the US and they needed to know what was on the phone, they put pressure on Apple to open that phone. And therefore, I think everybody's positions have been modified, right? Because I think countries like China and Russia initially saying there must be a UN treaty and every country is equal and must be able to run the internet jointly. I mean, I can imagine the nightmare if 200 countries had to agree on every principle to do with the internet. Have realized that there has to be multi-stakeholderism, right? And the countries that were saying that leave the private sector alone, they're doing a jolly good job on running the internet, like the US, is suddenly realizing that on national security issues, on terrorism, on the use of the internet for promoting violent extremism, that even the most liberal democracy has to weigh in on this, and there would be exceptional circumstances under which they would need privacy to be violated, or what would be seen as privacy being violated. But as I mentioned, I think it has to be under very stringent judicial conditions, judicially moderated conditions. You need a court order, or you need, there really has to be a danger. The other thing I wanted to mention, Bharat, is in many countries, now this can vary from, say, authoritarian regimes who are very afraid of mobilization of rebel movements or Arab Spring type uprisings and things like that. That's one end of it. But the other end of it is, let's take a democracy like India. You've had situations where social media or even a simple thing like a text messaging service on a mobile phone has been used to cause considerable social unrest. And I don't mean from the point of view of people not liking what the government is doing. That's a different kind of worry. I'm saying where, I come from a city called Bangalore in the south of India, and they put out a terrible campaign using both social media and the mobile telephone network to say that they said that the members of the Islamic community in Bangalore were going to actually rise up and slaughter everybody from the northeast who was there because, they were angry about riots that had happened in the northeast of India where Muslims had been, it was allegedly against Bangladeshi Muslim immigrants by the local people from the northeast of India. And what they did was they put fake news, they put photographs of what was happening to the Rohingyas in Myanmar or in Burma on these networks and said this is what had happened in the northeast, whereas the northeast riots were actually deplorable, though they were much less violent and graphic, and literally tens of thousands of young people from the northeast who worked in the hospitality industry, who were students in Bangalore, just fled the city because they believed this fake news. Now, in a situation like that, is the government entitled to shut down the social networks? Is it, entitled to intervene, or is that a violation of freedom of expression and of human rights? So it's very, very hard, to define what is national security. It's not necessarily just an attack on your airports or your power grid. It can simply be terrorizing a section of your population. It can be inciting riots. It can be, so that's the difficulty, with sovereignty decisions. Because ultimately, if there is a terrible cyber attack or a terrible human catastrophe caused by using cyber channels, who would be held accountable? They're not going to say Google is responsible. They're not going to ask Google to give an explanation. They're going to say, what was the government of India or the government of Myanmar or the government of the US doing? And you will be held accountable by your citizens. So that's the real dilemma for governments. That's the dilemma of sovereignty versus universality. The system should be universal, certain values should be universal, but it doesn't always happen that way.
On a slightly related but totally different note, I read about this legal case in Texas. I don't know how many of you have heard. The driver was FaceTiming with somebody, with his family, and ended up crashing into another car. And it killed his child inside the car, and he was suing Apple for inventing FaceTime.
No, I hadn't heard of this one, but I think that's
I don't know who won
that's
the
a note
case.
of light relief in this. I mean, people, I've always heard it's a very litigious society, but now I believe it. If somebody would actually do that.
People who spill coffee in their lap at McDonald's and sue McDonald's.
Because the coffee is too hot.
Too hot.
Yeah.
You had an
That coffee was
incident here in
argumentative too
Washington
hot.
D.C.
Yeah.
on a much smaller scale because it involved one person who believed fake news, I think put out that Hillary Clinton had arranged for somebody to be kidnapped and was being held in a pizza parlor in D.C. And this gentleman walked in with a rifle. And,
Yeah, I think I read about that one. Yeah.
But then how do you go about enforcement when some of these things, as you pointed out, can start out in country A and bounce to country B to C? And how do you find agreement to enforce these things and impose penalties on people?
You know,
Is it based on potential or harm to other individuals, and then how do you get countries to agree to it?
I think when you've got better tools for attribution, you know, and that's where I think research and development and pooling our knowledge comes in. I think if you were to pool combined wisdom of how do you do this, I mean, I've seen very sophisticated systems at the, say, the GCHQ in the UK, where they actually do track where the attacks are coming from, but they go a little deeper. You know, it may appear on the map that it's originating from India, but then they have a way of going in with the IP address and going further. But then that's where you come into the question of capability. Does every country have that capability? And the answer is no. I think the more advanced economies that have already invested a lot in R&D and who've got the technology have a better chance of having accurate attribution done. The developing countries may not, and that's the real fear of those of us who are working on trying to impose norms and trying to, well, not impose, but trying to evolve norms, if you like, and trying to come to some kind of agreement, because it would be so easy to trigger an actual act of kinetic or physical war based on a misunderstanding of who triggered the cyber attack.
And Kaprinsky Labs, which
Yeah.
does a lot of that,
Yeah.
is now just taking criticism from the United States
Yeah.
of saying we can no longer rely on Kaprinsky as a sort, a possible identifier for attribution
Yeah.
because it's Russian.
Is it Kaspersky? You're
Yeah.
talking about Kaspersky Labs. Yeah, that's right. And you know, so that's the whole problem, because then you're looking at the nationality of the cybersecurity provider, and you're casting aspersions on their integrity based on their nationality.
They were accepted almost universally
Yeah.
until this last decision by the United States
Yeah.
to say you're Russian, so we have to.
But you know, that is part of the whole geopolitical tension problem I spoke about. You know, I mean, suppose there's a country that doesn't like the U.S., they would say anything semantic puts out is the same. You know, so that's where you have to really get to a stage where you're not putting sovereignty first in certain issues. You have to put universality and technical competence first in other issues. But human nature being what it is and politics being what it is, I don't really see that this will ever go away, this problem of identifying people by labels of nationality or which country the attack is originating from. And sometimes it suits geostrategic purposes to put it in a particular country, to be realistic, you know, that this has happened and it will happen.
Can I ask? I'm a little confused on what you say about you know, decryption should fall under rigorous judicial review.
Yeah.
And obviously you mentioned that's state-centered.
Yeah.
But the capacity, judicial capacity, and also levels of corruption and so forth are so widely varied across the globe. So, I mean, we might have more confidence in a U.S. court to rule on decryption in a national security matter as opposed to a Russian court or
Yeah.
an Iranian court.
Yeah.
So how do you address that issue? I mean, would The Hague become relevant as international arbitration, or?
I think that's the whole point, you know. If you don't agree to have some kind of an agency, let's just take the IAEA, with whom I worked for some time, you know, the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, right? Like every country has its own nuclear program, those who do have nuclear programs, either civil nuclear programs or nuclear weapon programs. But they all come under the IAEA inspection regime, for what it's worth. And usually if a country says, if the IAEA says the country's nuclear installations are safe, you know,
It's a
that is
self-financial
taken as okay, you know, or if they recommend that certain kinds of fuel be removed or buried or transferred or, you know, and so on and so forth. So the question is, would it help to have an agency like that in cyber? And, you know, the way it was done in the IAEA is that it was only the nuclear nations who are really in that group, right? But there's the general conference where every country on earth is there. And where all of them can express their views on, say, universal non-proliferation, destroy all nuclear weapons, whatever it is they want to talk about, you know. So can we think of a similar mechanism to address this problem in cyber? And that runs contrary to the school of thought that says, let's not have a UN treaty, let's not have a multilateral system. So as I said, you know, I think you'll have to have different mechanisms to address different issues. And national security issues, I don't think you have any choice except to let governments play the lead role there. But I don't think you should leave out the technical organizations, the private sector,
I mean, like, you have
and academia, because you need all of those. Governments just don't have the capability to deal with cyber crises.
I mean, you have agencies like the International Telecommunications Union
Yeah,
to arbitrate on frequency allocations and
on telecom, right?
telecom
But
issues.
when they tried to get into the cyber
Yeah,
area,
I mean,
that was
like even in the space realm, you have a very conflicting roles that the Conference on Disarmament plays with the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs.
That's right.
Where the Outer Space Affairs just deals with science and peaceful uses of outer space. The Conference on Disarmament deals
Talks
with
about the
militarization and
about it.
weaponization. But the issues are also interlinked, so it ends up nowhere.
Yeah.
And it does not get discussed anywhere. That's consequently, it just reaches a stalemate.
Yeah, but that's true of most cases, you know. I mean, you would have a plethora of organizations doing different things because you have, for instance, in outer space itself, you know, you're right. But in the IAEA, for example, you have also the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, you know, the medical research, how it's being used for treating cancer, how it's being used to make mosquitoes sterile so that, you know, through radiation or nuclear radiation so that malaria doesn't spread and so on and so forth. And you also have the
IA
looking at the fuel,
yeah,
right?
in some sense, the EA is a very unique, the level of maturity, the peaceful uses of nuclear
Energy, yes.
energy and nuclear weapons is reached is not, that level of maturity is not being reached either in space, I would argue, or cyber is still ways ahead.
Ways ahead, yeah. But you have examples, you know, like I mentioned the ICAO or the International Civil Aviation Authority, right? If you didn't have international civil aviation agreements and accords, can you imagine the chaos in the skies? And there are national civil aviation authorities, right? And definitely countries control the airspace above their territory or have the right to object to what is done in that airspace. Yeah, and there is a universal language which everybody is speaking, and so, you know, that's the real issue. Are you prepared to say that cyberspace is now a global commons and that we need to evolve the same kind of, and I by no means saying there should be an overarching treaty. The same way that in the nuclear world as well, IAEA is not the last word.
Yeah.
You have the Nuclear Suppliers Group, you have other bodies, you have the Non-Proliferation Treaty, you know, you have many bodies that are looking at different aspects of nuclear. And it's not a perfect solution. There are no perfect solutions. The question is, can we, I always tell people, you know, there's no way I can create, when I was in government, I used to tell people in India, there's no way we can create a cybersecurity arrangement that will be completely safe. All we can hope for is for it to be safer than it is now. You know, we just can hope to make it safer. But you know, as a joke, I used to tell people, they said, what have you learned from all these years of working on cyber issues? I said, I've learned that if there's anything really confidential, to never put it on a computer and to write it out by hand and lock it up in a cupboard and keep the only key with me, you know, because that's the only way you can be 100% sure that that information is not going to leak. It was a joke, but it really is true. I mean, that's why security agencies block the USB ports so that nobody can put in a USB or connect an outside device to the computer. That's why you have standalone computers that are not connected to the internet to type confidential documents on. You know? And
This again seems like it's more of an argument for offensive capabilities.
yeah, yeah, in a way. But, and I believe there are now agencies that want manual typewriters to be brought back to ensure security. So, who can say?
On that note,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.